Well, thank you everyone for coming to my talk. The title of my talk today is The State, the School and the Sugarloaf, Winchester College and the Civil Wars. In 1655, Winchester College, a school in Hampshire, bought a surprising pet. The college accounts for the year reveal that there was a fox being kept on college grounds, with its chain being mended. This is a strange addition to college life, and the rationale and timing for buying it are unclear. What is stranger still is that this small quirky detail is one of the most remarkable changes to Winchester College in the 1650s. The purpose of my talk today is to tell the story of Winchester College during the period of the 1640s and 50s, known as the British Revolution or Civil Wars, when battles were fought and a king was decapitated, and explain why this school managed to emerge with little changed. To tell this story, I will talk more widely about what life was like in Winchester during the period, and try and get across the enormous destruction and transformation people lived through. Now, just a note, the period is often known as the Civil Wars because there were three in quick succession. I will talk about the whole period and refer to it as the Civil Wars, but I will call the First War, which is the most famous, as the Civil War, singular. I will start the talk by describing the experiences of this first Civil War in Hampshire and Winchester to introduce us to the period and the destruction and misery it caused. This will give us the necessary context for the second half, where I will move on to focus on Winchester College specifically and ask how it avoided a lot of the disruptions suffered elsewhere. I will explain its escape and the odd role sugar played in this story. Although altogether, I hope to get across how this was a period when people's lives were turned upside down and the world seemed to utterly change. Yet, in the middle of all this turbulence, Winchester College seemed to continue almost completely as before. Indeed, Winchester College, by the standards of the time, had a fairly pleasant war. This is surprising given the violent nature of the period. In 1642, a civil war broke out between the king, Charles I, and his parliament, and you can see some pictures of Charles I on the screen, with their supporters being nicknamed Cavaliers and Roundheads respectively. The causes of the war and motivations of each side are very complex, but they were based on issues of the greatest importance, such as the future of government and religion. Broadly speaking, Parliament, especially the zealous Protestants known as Puritans, thought Charles wanted to take too much power for himself, rule in a despotic manner, and to take the church in a worrying direction away from proper Protestant tradition towards something too ornate and authoritarian, maybe even a little Catholic. Royalists, on the other hand, thought Parliament wanted to destroy all the traditional hallmarks of England, starting with its monarchy and moving on to its church, unleashing a Parliament-dominated religious free-for-all. This is a crude summary, but introduces the basic point. The civil wars fought because people felt very strongly about the issues involved. England started the wars with a monarchy and the Church of England. Parliament won the war, and by 1649, the king had been executed, the church disestablished, a republic declared, and the world changed. It was only in 1660 that Charles II and the monarchy returned, something known as the Restoration. Surrounding these events was carnage as the Civil War raged. It was a miserable affair, yet Winchester College seemed not to suffer too badly. True, it had some money worries. Some tenants had found themselves unable to pay rent due to moving armies. The school itself had troops quartered on its lands, and the warden, John Harris, had to write petitions to MPs saying the school was £400 to £500 in debt, around £90,000 in today's money, according to the Bank of England. And so, Harris said, the school needed to be exempted from various taxes on food, or the children would starve. However, financial pressures aside, the school survived intact and fairly well. The college buildings did not suffer any appreciable damage, and the staff of the school remained largely unchanged. The college basically managed to ride out the period in almost the same state which it had entered it. This fairly quiet experience was unusual both nationally and in Winchester itself. The basic point of this talk is to explain why Winchester College had the experiences it did, and I think to answer this question, it is necessary to explain what was going on in Civil War Winchester and what the fighting meant for the people at the time. Something that I want to emphasize, and I think is the key to understanding the Civil War experience, is how disorientating it was to live through. By this, I mean that it caused immense upheaval in political, religious, and social life, and left people uncertain where they stood in relation to not only their country, but each other. To understand why people at the time acted as they did, we should try and imagine how immensely bewildered they were. Now, this isn't meant to be an accurate comparison, but I think the type of seismic change people went through would be similar to Boris Johnson announcing the UK was now a communist country, declaring war on the Queen, and winning. In the 1640s, the fundamental signposts of people's lives were removed. The monarchy, widely considered a natural and necessary part of politics, was abolished following a brutal conflict. In 1649, when the king was executed, England became a republic, the last time this was the case. The Church of England was dismantled and bishops removed. People frequently talked about the world being turned upside down, and radical groups such as the Levellers and Diggers advocated theories which are often described as proto-democratic and proto-communist. An image of the changed times was captured when Bishop Curl of Winchester, besieged at his palace in Bishop's Waltham, allegedly escaped in a cart under a pile of manure. Another example of turmoil came with religious radicalism. This was very important because people at the time were far more religious than we are today. Religion was a part of people's lives in a way which it is hard to understand in the 21st century. When the Church of England was dismantled, many people and sects began springing forward, offering their own alternatives. There was far more concern at the time than the numbers of such radicals warranted, but they were seen by polite society as a threat to morality and correct social hierarchy. Hampshire had its own such example in the notorious instance of William Franklin, a rope maker from London, who came to Andover in 1649, devoted follower Mary Gadbury in tow, and announced that he was the Messiah and Gadbury was the bride of Christ. And here in the slideshow, we see a pamphlet, Pseudo-Christus, which was written describing the William Franklin case, and another very famous pamphlet etching from the time describing the world turned upside down. In returning to Franklin's case, in a few weeks after arriving in Andover, things went downhill, and eventually the constable came to arrest the pair. Arriving, he found the couple together in bed and was told by them to remove his shoes because he did step on holy ground. If you're interested in this extraordinary story, then do look up Hampshire History Histbites, where there is a podcast on it. In any case, Franklin broke at trial, recanted, and the entire enterprise came crashing down, but not before it had attracted interest and followers. One memorable disciple was William Holmes Jr. of Houghton. Holmes was found by one shocked clergyman trying to convert two workmen the minister had employed. Holmes was making his point, quote, having a gun in his hand. The clergyman was singled out by Holmes as damned and bravely, or at least riskily, tried to urge Holmes to recant and, quote, have God in your heart. He answered, what dost thou know what God is? God is a toad, a snake, and a devil. As this gun-wielding apostle shows, this was a time of religious and social excitement. Old certainties about the right order of the world were crashing down. The type of confusion and upheaval people suffered was not just in the wider world, but also in their personal relationships. Think about this. Take a cause you believe in enough to fight for, environmental, political, whatever. Picture it. Then imagine that a civil war broke out over it. Think about the people in your life who would likely fall on the other side of the divide in this issue. Try and imagine how you would act towards them and they to you. Then throw in a gigantic war which kills a huge percentage of the population and destroys property in the old order, and you can nearly understand what it must have been like for people in Hampshire 400 years ago. This would have made people's lives extremely complicated. People weren't fighting and killing strangers or traditional enemies like the French, but rather friends, family members, and neighbours. Many found it hard to navigate this new state of affairs. During the war, Parliament's general in the area wrote to his royalist counterpart, once a close friend and now his rival, and summed up the sad situation in a letter which I will read in full, and here it is on the screen. Sir, the experience I have of your worth and the happiness I have in your friendship are wounding considerations when I look at this present distance between us. Certainly, my affection to you is so unchangeable that hostility itself cannot violate my friendship. But I must be true wherein the cause I serve. That great God, which is the searcher of my heart, knows with what a sad sense I go about this service, and with what a perfect hatred I detest this war without an enemy. But I look upon it as an opus domini, and that is enough to silence all passion in me. The God of peace in his good time will send us peace. In the meantime, we are upon the stage and must act those parts that are assigned to us in this tragedy. Let us do so in a way of honour and without personal animosities. Whatever the outcome, I will never willingly relinquish the title of your most affectionate friend, William Waller. Along with the confusion in people's lives, the civil wars caused an immense degree of destruction. The Civil War was miserable. Between 1642 to 9, 1 in 10 of the adult male population in Britain died. That is more than in either world war. Many towns, such as Brentford, were sacked, and there were regular reports of atrocities by both sides. A lot of the misery, however, was of a more indirect nature. The major killer was not battles, but disease, illness spreading through the movement of armies and people. If you were lucky enough to survive battles, pillaging, and plague, you could still face financial hardship. Parliament relied on a slick and enormous tax machine to fund its war efforts, an irony given one of the major causes of the civil wars was Charles's fondness for high taxation based on his royal prerogative. If taxation didn't get you, then the wars found other ways to rob you, with soldiers often taking what they needed to survive and with moving armies damaging property. This was the case for poor Anne Searle, a tenant of Winchester College. Searle was a widow with 6 children, all under 14 years old. At some point after the Civil War, she wrote a letter to her landlord, the warden of Winchester College, explaining that she was behind in rent due to the wars when she had lost over £120, about £22,293 in today's money. Searle had suffered a wretched time in the wars. First, royalist soldiers under Ralph Hopton had come. Incidentally, the iron gates which were at Ralph Hopton's headquarters in the Civil War eventually ended up at 54 Chesil Street, where they can still be seen today. Well, anyway, Hopton's troops had stolen 100 sheep. Those that were caught on Searle took away many of her goods, quote, within doors and about the house when they left, beside the frights and fears, which was no little grief to me. After scares and larceny had come more soldiers under Sir William Bedford, and then the taxes she had been forced to pay to both royalist and parliamentarian armies, quote, which could not be avoided, living between 2 contrary garrisons. Searle was not alone in having a horrible war. Winchester's experiences more widely were fairly typical of the period. Please change slide. Large swathes of England were battlegrounds during the war, passing between king and parliament each campaigning season. Bar a few areas of England which were firmly royalist or firmly roundhead, it was usual for a county to be split between different factions and to change hands depending which army was nearby. Hampshire was no different, with each side regularly gaining the upper hand, only to lose it when the other counterattacked. This was not a particularly heroic life. Bar the occasional big fight, a lot of the war in the county was a series of movements, skirmishes, and small sieges.
One particular fight is notable for its unusual circumstances, but not necessarily for its small scale. The stepson of the royalist commander of Winchester Castle died in a skirmish when a party from the garrison had, quote, a great drinking day at Winchester, and being elevated in their minds, close quote, rode out of Winchester 200 strong to fight some parliamentarians. His death, while tragic, probably did save him from a bad hangover. The cycle of ebb and flow, which marked the first few years between 1642 to 4, would eventually come to an end as Parliament began winning the war, such as at the notably big Battle of Cheriton in 1644, and eventually the Royalists were pinned in Winchester Castle. On June 14, 1645, the King's army was decisively defeated at Naseby in Northamptonshire, and after that, the war in Hampshire was effectively a mopping up operation, as Oliver Cromwell came with cannon to crack the last few royalist fortresses such as Basing House and Winchester Castle. Unfortunately, Oliver's battery does not actually seem to have been where Cromwell set up his cannon. That name seems to be wishful thinking. Instead, Cromwell, according to tradition, set up his headquarters at 24 St. Thomas Street. Could we change slide, please? And here is a picture of that road leading into the High Street. In any case, by October 1645, when the castle surrendered, Winchester's involvement in the Civil War was over. The effects of the Civil War in Hampshire and Winchester had been violent. The movements of armies could easily become destructive. When William Waller, the parliamentary general in the south, nicknamed William the Conqueror, told the royalist commander William Ogle to deliver Winchester Castle, he threatened to plunder Ogle's home in Stoke Charity and burn the city. Ogle, pretty coolly, replied that he had already removed all the precious goods from his house at Stoke, and besides, the house was old and from his wife's family, not his own. As for the threat of fire, quote, if he pleased to burn the city, it would make a very spacious and fair garden for the castle, close quote. Maybe Ogle didn't care if the city burnt down. The royalists, after all, set fire to Alresford to cover their retreat from the Battle of Cheriton, and destruction was accepted, if not embraced. Damage most notably touched Winchester when Parliament soldiers sacked the cathedral in December 1642. This is one of the major incidents to happen to the city in the whole period, and also illustrates the violence and anger of the wars, so it's worth detailing for a bit. In one of the ebbs and flows of the campaigns, the city was captured by the parliamentarians. The mayor was pretty desperate to avoid a pillaging, and so the city and army agreed a fee of £1,000 to avoid this fate, nearly £200,000 in today's money. Unfortunately, the army had other ideas. Being a soldier in early modern England was a pretty wretched life, often entailing sleeping in fields with no pay. It was enormously difficult to actually remunerate soldiers, and one of the reasons Oliver Cromwell was such a popular and successful commander was his ability to make sure his troops in Eastern England regularly received payment. Frequently cash-strapped and enduring all kinds of deprivations, the risk of soldiers running riot in a conquered town and taking everything that wasn't nailed to the floor was very real, and this was what happened in Winchester. The commanders seemed to have lost control of their troops, who went on a rampage, looting houses in the cathedral close under the guise of looking for Catholics and royalists. One eyewitness memory describes seeing, quote, 4 or 5 pulling at one cloak like hounds at the leg of a dead horse. Soon attention turned to the cathedral itself. Winchester Cathedral had been renovated in the 1630s to make it more colourful and decorative. Colour and decoration were not liked by the Puritans. They did not like this type of cathedral, and indeed, they did not necessarily like the very idea of cathedrals. The concept of a place being consecrated ground was itself increasingly questioned by various contemporaries, with God being felt to dwell everywhere, and medieval cathedrals representing medieval superstition. There were already many precedents for iconoclasm in England, but when people went into churches and removed or destroyed things they deemed as distractions from pure worship, for example, stained glass windows and ornamentations. Many places of worship suffered bizarre fates in this period. One place in Manchester was used as a gunpowder factory. St. Swithin's Church in Winchester was let during the Commonwealth, quote, to one Robert Allen. His wife delivered of children at one end, with a hogsty made at the other end. The soldiers went into the cathedral with their tempers raised, and probably many accustomed to see such places as suspicious, even heretical. The result was an orgy of violence, which can still be seen today when visiting the cathedral. Please change slides. The soldiers entered through the western door, riding horses down the nave, and eventually proceeded to smash up the medieval mortuary chests. And on my screen, it doesn't seem that the writing is showing up a bit oddly, but the mortuary chest is on the left. These were boxes holding the bones of Anglo-Saxon and Danish kings of England, along with various bishops. These were pulled down and the bones scattered. Windows were smashed, tombs defaced, anything valuable and portable carried off. The soldiers, getting their hands on clerical garb, rode off into the winter night dressed as priests. An account of another bout of pillaging in the cathedral a few years later probably captures the atmosphere of this earlier experience. At this later time, cathedral records were plundered by soldiers, quote, diverse thrown into the river, diverse large parchment being made into kites of wool to fly in the air, which is a wonderful image. A visitor today can see the legacy of the devastation. If you walk into the cathedral, and don't try and dodge the ticket charge, you come into the west of the nave where the troops entered. If you turn around and look up at the great western window, which is on the right of the picture, again, it seems that the text in the slides hasn't come through for some reason, you will see that it looks closer to abstract art than a normal picture. A series of tiny fragments glued back together after the soldiers broke it. How it was broken is a bit unclear. Some say the troops shot it, others that they threw bones from the mortuary chests through it. Some others say the very unlikely idea of Cromwell firing a cannon through it. In any case, if you let your eyes go down, you will see two statues of James and Charles I standing by the doors. If you look closely, you will notice a hole in James's robes behind his legs. It was made by a musket ball, as the soldiers fired and hacked at the statues. Incidentally, the survival of those statues is a story in its own right, because they were buried for safekeeping in someone's garden and then only later returned to the city after Parliament was finished. Anyway, if you turn around and walk down the cathedral and know where to look, more clues become apparent. The mortuary chests include two made after the restoration of the monarchy, with a Latin quote and date describing what had happened. And into those chests, the swept up remains of these bones were put. The lack of old stained glass in the cathedral is notable, and the effigy of Bishop Beaufort, a medieval clergyman, has 17th century shoes because the original medieval versions were damaged by the soldiers. As we have seen then, the civil wars were a traumatic period. They altered the reference point of people's lives, they problematized day-to-day relationships, and they caused masses of damage. However, one tomb in Winchester Cathedral, which was not significantly damaged, please change slides, was that of William of Wykeham, a medieval bishop of Winchester and founder of Winchester College and New College in Oxford. This fact allows me to segue into the next part of my talk regarding Winchester College itself. Now, if you go on one of the cathedral's wonderful guided tours, they will tell you a very enjoyable story which goes something like this. As the Roundheads wrecked the cathedral, one man stood with a drawn sword at the door of Wykeham's tomb, refusing to allow anyone to desecrate the memorial. This man was an officer in the Roundhead army, but also a former pupil at Winchester College, and, being devoted to his school to an alarming degree, had no wish to see the founder insulted. This is a fun story, but historians get their kicks from destroying other people's entertainment, and such was the case when a scholar called Arthur Leach, in his history of the college, took great pleasure in showing that this legend is very, very unlikely. As Leach pointed out, this story only seems to have originated a long time after the events it described. The officer in question has been named as different people, and financial records show that William of Wykeham's tomb did indeed suffer some damages and was renovated after the restoration. I should say, in case a cathedral tour guide is actually listening, that this is not conclusive proof that the legend is false, and I'm all for people believing whatever stories they like. When I was a child, I was told the story I mentioned earlier about Cromwell firing a cannon through the west window, and I still think it's a shame that isn't true. However, regardless of the truth, the story of Wykeham's tomb introduces us to a wider point, that things associated with Winchester College survived pretty well, and the school had Roundhead friends. For the rest of my talk, I want to return to the question which I began with. How and why did Winchester College have the relatively peaceful experiences it did? Winchester College was already by the start of the Civil War an extremely old school, founded in 1382. Topically, its origins were in the plague. The Black Death led to a shortage of clergy, which the school, through educating a new generation, was supposed to help redress. The college began the wars being royalist and managed to end them pretty much unscathed with its staff in place. Parliament occasionally sent visitations, basically inspections, but attention was battered away. The basic answer to why it survived as it did is that the college had powerful friends and was led very well by its warden, John Harris. Could we change slides again, please? However, I have to stretch this out to make this into a proper length talk, so I'm going to suggest there is more to the story than just that. I think that charting how Harris acted and why the school survived is a case study in how people navigated the post-war mess and tried to figure out where they stood in relation to others. So Warden Harris had to be brilliant as a political operator because he and the school were in a lot of trouble when Parliament came knocking. Led by Harris, who was a Greek scholar afflicted by hay fever, one of the most memorable bits of Winchester College archives is coming across a description of him sneezing perennially at roses. Led by Harris, the school had been firmly royalist and supported Charles I to a comically unfortunate degree. They had sent their precious plate to the king. They had asked for his protection of the school during the wars. Harris had even prayed publicly for both the king and the royalist commander of Winchester Castle, Lord Ogle. The college fellows who ran the school were likewise committed royalists. One of them, Gilbert Coles, which is a great name, was kicked out of Oxford University by Parliament in 1648, and a week later was made a fellow at Winchester. Royalism also seems to have been hereditary in the Harris family. In the Winchester College archives is a gem of a source, an anonymous biography of Harris written by a contemporary on the backs of the warden's old letters. Could we please change slides? Now, you can see it on your screen. This is a very colourful pen portrait with lots of interesting anecdotes and stories, one of which details how Harris's own son attempted to spring Charles I from parliamentary captivity when the doomed monarch was being taken for execution in London. Unfortunately, how the plot failed, since Charles did indeed lose his head on a cold January day in 1649, or whether it even was attempted, is unknown. But perhaps it was for the best that it did not seem to go very far. Captain Robert Burleigh was hung, drawn, and quartered in Winchester in 1648 for trying to do the same and rescue the king from captivity. To all intents and purposes, Harris and Winchester College were running a royalist institution throughout the 1640s and 1650s, doing plenty to antagonize Parliament. An example of this is the pretty continuous attempts by the school to support and aid Cavaliers falling on hard times. The accounts, which record charitable donations, reveal payments to plenty of supporters of the king, including, memorably, the royal grocer. Harris was especially eager to help royalists who'd been kicked out of Oxford by Parliament and those with whom he had a blood tie, giving them advice and support. We've already mentioned Gilbert Coles, who was made a fellow of the college. A Mr. Beasley, mentioned as Harris's assistant at his church job of Meonstoke, was possibly the same John Beasley, also expelled from New College, Oxford in 1648. Roger Hypham, a fellow also at New, received a great deal of help from Harris, including the drafting of petitions to present to a parliamentary committee to protest his expulsion. There are a few more I could mention, but the case of Thomas Grent is perhaps the most symbolic. Grent was a relative of Harris who had been removed from Oxford, where he was a fellow of New College in 1648. He and his sister were practically adopted by the warden, becoming valued members of the warden's family, and Thomas was eventually made college physician. Grent stood as witness to the warden's will. He appointed one of Harris's sons an executor of his own, and he was remembered in the familial sections of the warden's sister Phoebe and son John. And incidentally, all of the Harris family seem to have ended up being buried in Compton Parish Church. Meanwhile, Grent's own sister received money for her dowry from Harris, since the Grent father was poor. Grent continued at Winchester and was eventually reinstated as fellow at New College following the Restoration, though he died soon afterwards and is buried in Winchester College Chantry. So Harris and the school were obviously anti-Roundhead. They had put their money on the king winning the Civil War, and in the aftermath of the conflict, tried to help royalists, or at least people Parliament didn't like. When the king lost the war, and eventually at his head, it must have seemed that it was only a matter of time before Winchester College was investigated and had its Cavalier staff thrown out. This had been the case at other schools and universities which had backed the king. At Eton, which may come as a shock to some to learn was royalist, the staff of the school had been similarly royalist and had consequently found themselves removed and an MP put in his head. Oxford and Cambridge, the two universities at the time, had regular purges where whole swathes of students and university fellows were kicked out for being insufficiently parliamentarian, and new, more amenable persons were put in. In fact, such was the level of wholesale change that one person in Oxford at the time complained that the university felt like somewhere which had just experienced an invasion by a barbarian horde. It might be thought that a sleepy provincial town like Winchester would escape a lot of attention. After all, the universities are big institutions which have always received a lot of interest, and Eton is right on the doorstep of London. Hampshire is further away, and it might be thought would provide a level of obscurity. This, however, was not the case for reasons to do with early modern education. Most people never went to school back then, and instead would get whatever education they needed through self-teaching or informal means of some kind. There were many schools, but most were very short-lived things tied to the life of the schoolmaster rather than a permanent institution where generations from the local community went. Winchester was one of the very few schools which was long-lasting. When it was founded in the 14th century, it was given the necessary economic security and endowments to survive perpetually, and was also large, able to support 70 scholars, i.e. those who did not have to pay for their education. There was no equivalent of Ofsted in the early modern period. There was no one central organization making sure schools were all doing things to a certain standard. Because there was no mechanism to check all schools, it was customary for governments in the period to limit themselves to a handful of larger schools and universities. In the Civil Wars, Parliament settled on this group as being Winchester, Eton, Westminster, and the two universities. This group did change a little over time, and more schools were added to the remits of various parliamentary committees. However, these were the main places of interest, and so Winchester was actually somewhere the Parliament was specifically interested in visiting and reforming. As I mentioned earlier, one of the best ways to understand the experience of the Civil Wars is to emphasize the difficulties they created and the messiness of day-to-day life. The school and its warden were faced with significant suspicion of their activities and loyalties. They also knew that to be kicked out of their jobs would likely lead to a life of penury and hardship. Most royalists ejected from schools and universities were forced to rely on friends and often had to travel significant distances to find somewhere to stay. Francis Mansell, the head of Jesus College, Oxford, was roughed up in Wales by soldiers after he was kicked out of his job. Harris and co were probably keen to avoid this type of experience, but unluckily for them, their royalism had attracted attention, and Parliament was primed to take an interest in schools like Winchester. At some point after 1645, the school faced an inspection. A second one came in 1649 to 50. In the first visit, Warden Harris was given a long list of accusations and charges which he had to answer. Please change slides. These were a very varied bunch. One said he had taken away a religious book his wife was reading. Another that he had prayed for the king's forces and destruction of their enemies. But what they had in common was the accusation that he was not a suitable schoolmaster under parliamentary rule. Harris survived this for reasons we will get onto in a second, but he didn't have very long to enjoy his reprieve. Within a few years, the second inspection of the school took place. This time, there was an added level of danger. Sir Henry Mildmay was a local MP whose house was very close to the modern Bugle Inn in Twyford. Sir Henry, nicknamed Sir Whimsy, apparently had set his eyes on the position of warden of Winchester College and therefore was particularly keen to remove Harris and take his job. So, a track record of being on the wrong side, 2 inspections in a few years, and someone coveting his job. How did Harris and the school survive this? I think to answer this, we need to remember how complicated people's relationships had become following the wars, when old friends were technically enemies. Many of the people tasked by Parliament with investigating Winchester College were not faceless bureaucrats sent by a faraway government. They were by and large people from Hampshire who had links to Harris and the school. It helped that Harris and some of the fellows were wealthy and well-connected people and plugged into the Hampshire social circuit. Harris owned a property in Silkstead, south of Winchester, which made him close neighbours of Richard Cromwell, son of Oliver, in Hursley, a relationship warm enough for Richard to send game to the school as a gift in 1654. One of the college fellows, William Wither, was connected to the influential Wither family of Manidown and Hall. The paterfamilias, William Wither, senior of Manidown, was an influential committee member for Parliament in Hampshire and father-in-law to Winchester College's headmaster, John Pottinger. Another member of the family, George Wither of Winchester, married the sister-in-law of the Winchester MP, Nicholas Love, in 1657. Thomas Muspratt, a mayor of Winchester, had a son at the school who was trusted enough to carry letters between the Harris family. As a result of these connections, the school had some very powerful friends on the Roundhead side. One example is Nicholas Love, an MP for Winchester. Next slide, please. Love was a son of a former warden of Winchester College and had been baptized at St. Swithin's Church just down College Street. Next slide again, please. Yes, there we are. Love proved to be a reliable friend to Warden Harris, but he was not the only ally. Another was the very influential Nathaniel Fiennes, an ancestor of modern-day Ranulph and Ralph. Nathaniel was the son of a prominent lord, Viscount Say and Seal, and an important politician and soldier in his own right. He was not only an alumnus of Winchester College, but founder's kin, i.e. someone who is supposed to have been related to the founder of the school, William of Wykeham. It was supposed to have been Fiennes who stood guard at Wykeham's tomb, and he likely played a key role if he needed to in protecting the school itself. College financial records revealed that around the time the cathedral was sacked in 1642, he stayed in the warden's lodgings, and his men were fed and watered there. If there were any threat to the buildings, then his presence probably went a long way to eliminating them. The point of deluging you of these names and friendly faces is that while these people were on the other side of the political divide from the royalist school, they were still friends and allies in some way. There therefore existed a very strange tension between personal and public loyalties, and it is remarkable how willing all these Roundheads were to help a crusty cavalier. People seemed very able and willing to distinguish between a cause they hated and a person they liked. An MP like John Lisle, whose wife allegedly haunts the Eclipse Inn on the Square, was an incredibly important Roundhead, but was also friends with John Harris and willing to help him when he could. This gave the school a chance for survival. Throughout the 1640s and the various investigations, Harris was able to lean on lots of parliamentarians, especially Nicholas Love, and exploit his contacts. So Love is really important in the story of Harris. He was remembered by John Nicholas, who was a scholar at Winchester during these years, as doing one good act, quote, which was to use the great power he had here to the protection of this society, close quote. Love became a regicide, one of those who executed the king, and a fervent parliamentarian. He was also an important figure in the Republic, the so-called Rump Parliament, gaining a reputation as a, quote, constant and contumacious rumper, close quote, and helping to design the new mace and coins of the Republic. However, he was also a close friend of Harris, and he felt a filial loyalty to the school, using his influence on several occasions to help the college avoid various taxes, including one on beer. And in one letter on this topic, and on the right of the screen, you can see one of the many letters Love sent to Harris. He told the warden that he had prevailed on the taxman to, quote, not to be too hasty in pressing you to it, i.e. the tax. When the second inspection of the school was ordered in 1649, Love took a similarly active role, acting as a consigliere for Harris, telling him in one letter to basically not engage with anyone before having the advice of himself or another friendly MP, Robert Wallop. Simultaneously, Love was giving advice to help Harris and the school bribe their way out of trouble. As the danger of a second visitation approached in 1649, Love wrote to Harris recommending, quote, that your peace may be more secured for the future, I would advise you at the assizes to apply to one Mr. Hill, a parliament man and a lawyer, close quote, who had spoken in favour of preserving the college and to offer Mr. Hill an annuity for legal advice. From the account books, we can see that Harris took this advice. In late summer 1649, and again in 1650, one Mr. Hill, probably Roger Hill, the MP for Bridport, is indeed listed as receiving money, £5, 8 shillings and 9pence, and then £5, each about £1,000 in today's money. And these were paid for allegedly legal fees. As a price for having another friendly MP on side, it was probably considered worth every penny. And Winchester was not alone in using money to sweeten those in Westminster. Eton College, for example, used similar tricks in 1649 when it looked like they would be landed with large taxes. One trip to London, quote, to procure from the Parliament the sense of the House, which is basically meaningless drivel, cost a staggering £57 4pence, which is over £10,000 today. Most of that was probably used wining and dining the MPs to get them on side. Evidence from Winchester's audit books suggests similar lavish trips to Westminster for vague college negotiations in the late 1640s. Between 1646 and 8, the college spent roughly £2 in total on such expeditions to London. Between 1649 to 50, when the second visitation was inspection was looking like it was around the corner, the total ballooned to £27, 10 shillings and 3pence, with a further £15, 3 shillings and 8pence for similarly vague fees in college business. So it is clear that a major part in the school's survival was played by friendly Roundheads. As I said, I think this really shows how blurred the lines between friend and foe could get in the civil wars, as neighbour fought neighbour. Harris understood that he could still do business with these people and was really adept at using their help. All interactions involve at least two sides, and it is important to not paint the college as a defenceless damsel rescued by unasked for help. Love may have told the warden who to bribe, but it was still the warden's responsibility to organise the operations. So we have royalists using friendly parliamentarians to survive. But this was not as straightforward as you might think. Most people had friends or family on the other side of the divide, but it was not a given that a royalist would ask for help. And there was a moral question for people like Harris. By surviving using parliamentarian aid, were they collaborating? Now, Puritan England was not occupied France. Royalists were not the resistance. Roundheads were not the Nazis. However, there was still very real qualms among many royalists about compromising in any significant way and tarnishing their consciences by serving in a public place under the Parliament. One royalist at Oxford said he'd rather live as a hermit in Wales than sell out. To stay on in your job into the 1650s was therefore actually a charged issue and made many very uncomfortable, especially when the monarchy was restored in 1660. It's always fun to ask the audience at this stage what they think they would have done in this situation. The options would have been to do what Harris did and get on with life, to go into exile, or to stay in England but try and avoid having anything to do with the new government, and maybe, if you were especially brave or foolhardy, plot to overthrow it. So we can perhaps come to what people think they would have done in the Q&A. Harris had few qualms and seems to represent one way you could go if you were on the losing side in the civil wars, which is make the best of a bad situation. This meant trying to keep your job, keep relatively quiet about your opinions, and treat people like Nicholas Love as old friends and overlook their politics. Such an attitude can be seen by how Harris continued to play an active role in the community and to keep up his friendships. In one letter to his son, he told him that he had nothing else to say, but the remembrance of Mr. Love to him. John Lyell and Nathaniel Fiennes received regular letters from Harris. One, and wonderfully, was handed to Fiennes by a doctor as the doctor bled him. This willingness to get on in the New World can be seen in a document from 1654 to do with repairing Winchester Cathedral. The church had suffered a miserable time through the previous years and was actually at one point nearly ordered pulled down. It survived, but was very dilapidated and damaged. Accordingly, a subscription was organized to repair the building, and the signatories were dominated by Roundhead figures, including people like Nicholas Love. And among the names was Dr. John Harris, warden of Winchester College. This was significant because of what it symbolized: a willingness to be associated with the other named persons on this project who were all Roundheads and to work with them. It is true that pieces of paper can often unite very different people, but this seems to symbolize a wider spirit of cooperation, which was allowing the college to draw on friendly faces to survive and to find a little nook in the new world. The same instinct for survival is shown in the curious story of the Sugarloaves. Now, Sugarloaves are cones of sugar and were the main form for transporting the product in the past. Can we go to the next slide, please? Sugar was a luxury good, and so a gift of a sugarloaf was an expensive present, similar to extremely expensive fine wine or truffles today. And just a small digression, wine snobbery was very much real in early modern England. John Harris spent the modern equivalent of £2,000 every year on claret, and was pretty miserable when the Parliament banned imports from France, since that kept him away from his favourite vintages. Anyway, back to sugar. Sugar was a luxury good, and indeed, a famous high-born lover of sugar was Elizabeth I, who accordingly lost all her teeth, and sometimes later, Napoleon's Josephine had to learn to smile without showing her back teeth because her love of sugar had rotted them. Winchester College had traditionally sent out sugar loaves as gifts to important local figures, but the practice had fallen into disuse during the wars. To help the college get through the difficulties with which it was faced, Harris revived the custom. Starting in 1649, the college began to send sugar loaves to local judges, the first batch costing £19 8p. That's over £3,500 today. Expensive presents. This was an innovation, and it started a trend where the school spent a large outlay on these offerings to important people. In 1650-1, a £2 sugar loaf was sent to the mayor of Winchester, and 2 loaves, costing a combined 32 shillings 9p, to justices of the peace. In 1651-2, the mayor, the justices, and Nicholas Love received sugar loaves with a combined cost of £4 6 shillings. In 1652-3, the mayor was excluded, and the outlay dropped to £3 3 shillings. In 1653-4, when the school seemed to actually be in a position of greater security, the loaves appeared to have shrunk, as the 3 sweets sent out to the mayor and judges came only to £2 and 12 shillings. The gift giving did not end then, but continued for the next few years, with the justices receiving these treats. The point of this gift giving was to secure relationships with the various local grandees who could destroy or save the warden and college. Harris was really quite a canny operator, and having decided that politics didn't need to come between friends, he tried to use whatever means he had to keep those friendships which were useful. The fact that there is such a strange disconnect between what all these people fought for publicly and how they treated each other privately is fitting, considering the enormous turmoil of the war. That people were aware there was a moral grey area, I think, comes out in the embarrassed attempts by old royalists, like those at Winchester College, to explain why they spent the 1650s in cushy positions working with Roundheads. Harris died in 1658, but there were still people at the college after the monarchy returned in 1660 who felt they needed to defend their conduct. Can we go to the next slide, please? As I mentioned, and again, for some reason, the text hasn't come through, but that is Charles II sitting in majesty. As I mentioned, one source I've used in this talk is the biography of Harris. This was certainly written after the restoration of the monarchy, and it sets out its purpose pretty blatantly when it says, quote, "I know some are ready to censure both him and the fellows that they were designed to keep their places in such times. But the truth was, he apparently saw that it was the only public or considerable school that was not infected with the venom of the times, and there was always enough of the old leaven left in the school to convert any boy from the principles of those ill times." Close quote. Other people were doing similar excusing. Robert South had been a schoolboy at Westminster and then a student at Oxford during the 1640s and 1650s. During this period, he made the unfortunate decision of contributing to a book of poems celebrating Oliver Cromwell as a wonderful leader and so forth. When the political situation changed, this was a matter of obvious embarrassment, and so South reversed ferret, trying to hide his past activities under a whole layer of myth-making. Thus, in an undelivered sermon, South declared that during his school days, the entire student body prayed for Charles I on the very day of his execution, and showed themselves to be, quote, king's scholars, and a general pain in the Parliament's neck. All in all, I think you could agree it's a slightly suspicious argument. So I think it's time to draw this talk to a conclusion. What I've tried to show today is some of the effects the period known as the Civil Wars had on life. The general experience in Hampshire was often horrible, with plenty of violence and loss. Winchester College avoided the worst of this destruction mainly because it had a very able pilot flying the plane and lots of friends in the right places. However, even the college was having to figure out where it stood in a topsy-turvy world, and choices were not entirely straightforward, as worries about collaboration showed. Perhaps the experience of the last 18 months or so have made some of you listening feel a little bit in common with the various people I've discussed, trying to make sense of a rapidly changed world. Perhaps some of you are wondering what side you would have chosen in the Civil War, or what you would do in Harris's case. How would you treat friends if they were publicly your enemies? As I think these questions show, many of the issues which dominated people's lives in the Civil Wars still have relevance and resonance today, even if Sugarloaves have disappeared. Thank you.
That was excellent. Thank you so